And welcome to The Drum. I'm Patricia Karvelas. Coming up, Scott Morrison refuses to apologise to former Australia Post CEO Christine Holgate.
This has nothing to do with gender. This has to do with the performance of people who are responsible for running taxpayer organisations.
Lean, mean, killing machines. Australia's Defence Force is accused of being too woke and not focused on the business of war. And the kids are all right. Is our modern-day obsession with health and psychology leading to an overdiagnosis of ADHD? Joining me on the panel, Managing Director of advisory firm Yatsen Associates, President of the Chinese Australian Forum, and Labor Party member Jason Yat-sen Lee. In Melbourne, foreign editor at the Australian newspaper, Greg Sheridan. Reconstructive surgeon Dr Neela Janakiramanan, and in Canberra, advisor to the Social Policy Committee at the National Foundation for Australian Women and former senior public servant Mari Coleman. Welcome to all of you.
Great to be with you.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're also on Facebook. Scott Morrison has refused to apologise to former Australia Post Chief Executive Christine Holgate after she accused him of bullying her out of her job.
The language in the Parliament was very strong. It was not my intention to cause distress to Christine Holgate, and I regret any distress that strong language may have caused to her, indeed did cause to her. That was not my intention. But what this issue is about, ultimately, all of us who serve in senior positions, whether it's as Prime Minister, a Minister, or a Chief Executive or Managing Director of a government-owned company, we all have responsibilities. What this issue was about the appropriate way that taxpayers' money and taxpayer companies are run.
In November, it was revealed that Ms Holgate had used company funds to purchase 4 Cartier watches as thank yous for senior executives. Now, at the time, there were calls for her to stand down, including from the Prime Minister.
I think it's one of the worst acts of bullying I've ever witnessed. And even now, I have to take myself out of myself to watch it. It is an utter disgrace. So maybe if the Prime Minister's watching, he could give me a call, and I'd love an apology, but he could help me resolve my contract.
The Prime Minister has rejected Ms Holgate's claim that her gender was a factor in her treatment. OK, so gender apparently not so much the issue. I'm going to start with you, Greg Sheridan. Really? Gender wasn't an issue? It seems that there are many men who have had question marks around their conduct. They've been retained, but Christine Holgate was thrown under a bus, wasn't she?
Well, Patricia, I have a kind of fairly nuanced view of this. I think a male chief executive would have faced exactly the same reaction, but nonetheless, I think the criticism of her was exaggerated. At the same time, I think publicly owned companies do have to behave differently from privately owned companies. I mean, a private company can spend its money on Cartier watches if it wants to. A publicly owned company, a company owned by the government, is still responsible to the government. Its commercial position is backed by the taxpayer. The deals it does commercially are a consequence of its government purchasing power. Having said that, I think the criticism of her was exaggerated. She didn't deserve to lose her job. And I do think it illustrates a big problem we have in this country, that every now and again we designate someone as a public villain, and everybody has a licence to absolutely kick the crap out of them. And this is not a left or right thing. I don't even think it's predominantly a male or female thing. It's just that we get so enthusiastic to smash whoever has
Can we really
breached the rules.
remove gender from this proposition? We're at a particular point in time where women's issues are very much central, and it was quite clear that Christine Holgate was making that point, Neela, putting herself in that context, talking about the assassination of her in that context. Do you think her claim around that stacks up?
Oh, look, I think it probably does stack up. I think that, you know, if we look at, there has been a lot of water that has gone under the bridge since Christine Holgate first faced criticism in Parliament, including a number of allegations of misconduct amongst parliamentarians themselves. And I think the thing that concerns me is the strong words that the Prime Minister used with regards to her action, which was, you know, in balance, probably not that egregious, especially since she is now given evidence that she could have spent up to $600,000 rewarding those executives for what was probably quite an important deal. And instead she chose to spend a sum that was much, much smaller, even though it looks extravagant.
So it
and
looked fancy, didn't it? But actually from the numbers,
yeah, but
it maybe was more frugal than we would have thought.
Yeah, and I think that the consequences that she has endured and the terms in which the Prime Minister spoke about her, and lots of people in government spoke about her at the time, is not the terms that they've used since then for allegations and issues that are perhaps far more serious. And that is where I think she does have a right to say that gender has a place.
Jason, you are moving a lot in your chair, which makes me, think that you have very strong views here. In fact, I'm sure you do. The gender lens has been put on this, but this is also about process, right? She's the head of Australia Post, a very public execution. She says that she felt lent on.
She was summarily executed politically before she had a chance to put her case. I think there was a gender angle to this, a really clear one. I think if it was Christopher Holgate who'd given his executives season passes to the footy, I think it would have gone down very, very differently. So I think the fact that she was a woman and the nature of the gift sort of go hand in hand. But I think Greg said something really interesting. I think at the heart of this is a tension between Australia Post as a kind of quasi-public service institution and the fact that it has to compete in the private market with private competitors, right? So it has to get performance from its executives. It has to attract and retain the best people. So how does it do that effectively whilst living up to the very, very rigorous expectations of a public sector organisation? And I think really clear guidelines have to be put in place for executives and the boards of these organisations, otherwise they're just so vulnerable.
Yeah, Mari, there was a comment that Christine Holgate made at the time, which I think really led to a lot of her problems, that it wasn't public money, something like that, I'm paraphrasing. And that has been at the centre of the controversy too. Now, you were the first woman, actually, that was ever the head of a statutory authority. There are some vexed issues around statutory authorities. Did she do the wrong thing? Because it was within her remit, but clearly it didn't sort of, pass the, if I can use this awful term that I somehow always use, the pub test.
Look, there are issues about the management of statutory authorities. Jason is absolutely correct in pointing out that what we now have is a curious situation of entities which were public utilities, which have now been corporatised, but still remain with the government, in the person of two ministers in this case, as their shareholders. So they're not quite private sector, they're not quite public sector. The agency that I chaired was entirely public sector. I think the difficulty here is that we're dealing with something in Australia Post which has a certain level of public credibility. I think it's fair to say that if we look back in history, the introduction of the penny post, the introduction of publicly financed primary education, were among the things which were incredibly important in the development of modern democracies. And we're going back here now a couple of centuries. People have an affection for something like the post, and they expect it to work, and they expect it to be affordable. They don't expect the post to be something where they have to pay a fee of some exorbitant nature to be associated with it. So there is a tension there in the management itself of the organisation. Now, it is rather a pity that the board of Australia Post appears to have been stacked with people who are perhaps not as independent as they might be.
I just want to bring in, if I can, Neela on this, because the Prime Minister made a very deliberate decision today to use a form of the words which was to acknowledge that she'd gone through something difficult because of what he'd done, but not to apologise, right? This comes at the same time as he is, if you believe the published polls, under some degree of pressure from Australian women on some broader issues about his handling of women, issues relating to women. Why What's his political calculation here? What do you make of what he did, where he didn't apologise, he didn't pick up the phone? That's clearly what she wanted. Is this now going to go away for him as an issue?
Nope.
Oh, I think that the Prime Minister is very much hoping that it goes away as an issue. I'm not, and this particular issue probably will, but it becomes part of a pattern of problems. And I think that is the issue that Australian women have with the form of governance that we're seeing. It is very much based on the strongman ethic of, I did this thing, it was considered at the time, and I will never back down. And we see this play out across a lot of issues. I think that particularly at times when there are major issues that need resolution, and in the context of a global crisis, what the Australian people are looking for is vulnerability and a willingness to change and a willingness to actually listen to the voters, who we all are, and adjust approaches based on current events and current thinking. And I think that that's what we're not really seeing here.
And Greg Sheridan, the government's been explaining this afternoon. The Communications Minister has done an interview, broken his silence and really doubled down in many ways about the process that the government followed. Christine Holgate contests that version of events, if you like, and clearly, this idea that she chose very happily to resign. Quite obviously, it wasn't such a happy decision, and she felt lent on. Do you believe that version of events, that she was not lent on, that there wasn't pressure that was brought on her on the basis of what the Prime Minister said that day in the Parliament?
Well, Patricia, I think what was said in the Parliament was massive pressure itself. I mean, you and I and other people here, we kind of live in the world of public brickbats and everything. Gosh, everyone's having a shot at us all the time. But if you're a civilian, if you're not used to it, it's very disconcerting. And so I think there's no question that she was put under terrific pressure. And I think it was an overreaction. Remember, the Labor Party was also very agitated about these Cartier watches. I mean, she herself, I think she was very excessively criticised and badly done by. I don't think she handled it that well either. She should have just said early on, "Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realise it would cause community outrage. Looking back, I see for a publicly backed entity, that's probably not a good idea." Instead, I think, was it Nadia's comment, the public is looking for empathy now. They're looking for empathy from political leaders and corporate leaders. And when people say, a bit like Bronwyn Bishop saying, "Look, what I did was within entitlement," that cuts you no cookies with the public these days.
Yeah, that point you make about the Labor Party was made conveniently too, Jason, today by the Prime Minister, who said that it was a Labor Party that was also making this kind of commentary on that day, and I remember it very well. Seems like a bit of political revisionism, perhaps, by the ALP.
I think the point is that politics gets in the way of all of this stuff. I mean, so many of the issues that we're confronting at the moment is where populist politics and wanting to please a particular constituency throws a spanner into so many different works. And there are so many issues now, many of which we might be discussing today, where if the politics would just get out of it, we might do better.
Mari, final word to you on this very issue. Does this send a chilling message to women in power? Because that's been the way that this is interpreted by many women, that this public execution, if you like, of this woman in a very senior role sent a message that, women will be thrown under the bus in these circumstances.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that whatsoever. Whatever one might think about some of the recent ministerial reshuffles, there is a clear perception around that women will get little support from this Prime Minister, and it just fits, as Neela was saying earlier, with a whole pattern of earlier issues. I think this is extraordinarily damaging for this government and particularly for this Prime Minister.
Greg, I said final word, but I'm wondering, do you think that there is a pattern of behaviour from this Prime Minister in relation to women?
Well, I certainly think the Liberal Party has a women problem. And Neela, I apologise, I got your name wrong a minute ago. Look, the Liberal Party has a problem with women, there's no doubt. I mean, it was crazy when Tony Abbott appointed only one woman to his cabinet to start with.
He made himself the Minister for Women, Greg.
Yeah, well, I suppose he was showing commitment. But, there are modern rules of politics. You just can't disobey them. I mean, look at how diverse Boris Johnson's government is, not only on the gender score, but on the ethnic background score. And no one can say we don't do that sort of thing, because all kinds of drop kicks are included from different states because the states need representation.
It's a very kind way of putting them, yes.
I mean, they need to do much better.
Would you like to specifically name which drop kicks that you're talking about here?
No.
Really?
Word no.
Because I reckon we can dedicate the rest of the hour to the drop kicks that have been promoted above their station based on geography.
Speaking historically.
All right. Let's park this conversation and move to another. The Prime Minister has brought back twice weekly National Cabinet meetings in an effort to get Australia's vaccine rollout back on track.
I've called together the Premiers and the Chief Ministers for us to work together to deal with the problems we have in the vaccination program, which stem from two issues. The first one was the constraint in the supply from overseas for our doses of those imported vaccines. We had 3 million that were supposed to turn up in those first few weeks, and because of the problems in Europe, they did not arrive. But we were getting over the top of that problem, and the second issue that has come from outside the government's control is the medical advice regarding those remote risks associated with AstraZeneca. That will change how we do the rollout.
Scott Morrison says it's still possible that all Australians will have received at least one jab by the year's end, and to achieve that, he's given his blessing to the establishment of mass vaccination hubs. But the opposition leader says the Prime Minister is passing the buck.
Scott Morrison had just one job this year. It was to get the vaccines right, and it's been bungled. It's been bungled by his government, and now once again he's gone back to the old playbook of saying he'll have more meetings with the states and territories so that he can pass the buck, so he can pass blame off to the states and territories for the failure that has occurred with the rollout of our vaccines. That is the responsibility of his government.
Neela, as the doctor on our panel, medical doctor, you go first. Is the Commonwealth passing the buck to the states? Is this about absolving their responsibility at the Commonwealth level for what has clearly been a bungle?
It's hard to see it as any other way. States can't negotiate with foreign pharmaceutical companies. They can't give approval for novel vaccines. That sits very much within the scope of governance of the federal government. And so, you know, if we look at the pandemic over the last 12 months, you know, what has the federal government done? I mean, they passed off hotel quarantine onto the states. They passed off, you know, healthcare management onto the states. And there were operational reasons for that. But negotiating the vaccine and getting it into Australia is 100% the federal government's job. And in calling for more meetings, you know, I don't think that the vaccine rollout has had issues because of a lack of meetings, and I'm not certain that more meetings are necessarily going to improve the rollout of the vaccine. I think what we actually need is, again, some honesty from this government to say, what is the actual issue? You know, if the real issue is that the pandemic is accelerating in other parts of the world, more and more people are getting sick, more people were sick this week than this week last year. Is it that pharmaceutical companies are simply not selling it to Australia because they're preferentially selling it to countries where people are actively getting sick and dying? And if that is the case, then he needs to trust that the Australian population have the heart to understand this and to be willing to wait in turn. If that's not the case, if that they've actually bungled the negotiation in some other way, well, we don't know that either. So part of all of this is speculation because there has been a lack of honesty from the government. And then there is the next issue of, well, if we suddenly get 3 million, 5 million, 10 million, however many doses, how are we actually going to get it into people's arms? And that is a question that the medical community continues to ask, from GPs through to hospital doctors, because that infrastructure doesn't currently exist. And it needs to be built now so that we can do it in October.
Yeah, well, Jason, clearly there's been a couple of shifts, though, from the Prime Minister. Yes, we're getting these, you know, twice-a-week meetings. That clearly was successful during the peak of the crisis last year when the Prime Minister began this process. Like, no one really contests that, right? We know that having a better coordinated system clearly is helpful. And the other part is the pivot to this mass vaccination model. Do you give him credit for pivoting now? At least, you know, clearly you need to work with the states and territories better to kind of execute this plan.
Well, I think it can go any worse. Now something has to be done. And I mean, I just find it extraordinary that we're in this situation. I mean, it seriously looks like we're going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory out of all of this. It's just an extraordinary situation to find ourselves in. And I think what it shows is just the really short-term nature of political thinking. Right? So at the beginning of the pandemic, we should have had a holistic solution where you think about, well, how do we get Australia out of this mess? But instead, I think the timeline was, all right, how do we control the virus, shut the borders? We've done that well. So job's done. You know, we've won. And, you know, bring on an election because we've done so well. Not thinking through the next stage, and we should have stayed on a war footing all the way through, and that is, how do we actually come out of the other side, have an economic recovery, let stranded Aussies come back in, open up to the world, and what is a holistic solution for making all of this happen that we need to execute with military precision? There was never that sort of thinking, and it's really disappointing, you know, being in business. And I mean, one of the galling things about it is business and the university sector were piously lectured to diversify and not to put all their eggs in one basket. And the government, in terms of the vaccine supply, put all their eggs in two baskets.
Yeah. Greg, the eggs in the basket analogy is being used quite a bit because it's pretty apt for what's happened here. Clearly AstraZeneca has not been the success story that the government had hoped it would be. We are on the back foot now on the projections. It could be till 2024 that we have normal international travel that's restored. And if we continue to have our borders closed while the rest of the world is functioning, clearly it's going to have a hit on our economy and business. Do you think the government has erred here, that they have actually messed some of this up and that perhaps they've taken too long to fix it?
So, Patricia, I certainly think the government has not been perfect, but I'd be interested to see which government in the world has been perfect. This virus is a very cunning and adaptive enemy, and it keeps doing things to us which throw everybody out of whack. I mean, there are new strains which now attack young people, so countries which did well because they had young age profiles are now in a lot of trouble. The government has spent a vast amount of money on vaccines and made some very good decisions. I mean, we did not have a vaccine production capacity until the government decided to scrap all the free market arguments and instruct CSL to create a vaccine manufacturing capacity. Now, AstraZeneca, we're not the only people who put a lot of faith in AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca is probably the main vaccine used in the world, and it's now turned out to have this tiny risk of blood clots. Now, it's a serious matter because we're so successful in suppressing community transmission. People don't want to take the risk. One in 200 or 300,000.
Even in the execution of this, we've relied on the GP model. Now mass vaccination hubs are clearly the way they're going to try and get this jab out in the sort of final quarter of the year, Greg. Like, you know, the government has, the Labor Party and others, key figures have been calling for this mass vaccination strategy. It's only today that we hear that they've changed their minds. Why has it taken so long?
Well, that's right, and that's a fair point. I'd agree with that. And this is one area where I do think more meetings will be helpful in the short run because there was a bit of a lack of proper coordination with the states. But just to go through the counterfactual, and no one ever wants to be fair to any government, least of all me, I'm a journalist, but in fact what really has buggered us up is not the model of distribution, but unexpected severe interruptions in supply. We were supposed to get 3 million more AstraZeneca jabs earlier on, and they would have been administered before we all knew about blood clots if they'd come through, and so we would have got the 4 million, and so we'd have been a long way further down the track. And then we can only produce AstraZeneca jabs in Australia. If we switch CSL to doing something else, that's going to take a long time. Now they're out using all the Commonwealth's purchasing power to get more Pfizer vaccines. I absolutely agree it's suboptimal, but I think really if you put Australia against any other country in the world, it's not so suboptimal that we should be talking about a disaster or anything. And if we all get a jab by Christmas, that'll still be, I think, just about a pass mark.
Yeah, let's see how the Australian public sees it. Mari, do you think the sort of plan around this vaccination was all wrong from the beginning?
Yes, I do. I think that the government has been extraordinarily opaque in terms of providing information on how much vaccine is in the country. They've been very opaque about the arrangements for injecting it into those people whom the Commonwealth conspicuously agreed was their responsibility, the staff and residents of disability and aged care settings. It's obvious that that hasn't worked. I would think that what we've seen is an over-reliance on the faithful GPs to do the thing that they do with flu, and on contracting things out to private sector people with no proven track record of managing this kind of thing. It would have been infinitely better if this had been coordinated with state public health departments from the very beginning of the need to get vaccination in place.
Neela, is the Prime Minister pretty exposed on this now, because he set up this twice-a-week meeting with the premiers? We know that the premiers have been, how do I put this diplomatically? Oh, I'm not a diplomatic person. They're not shy about their criticism of the Prime Minister when they, and even to the point of the people, you know, of his own political party. Gladys Berejiklian just in the last couple of days saying, putting it quite clearly that she thinks this should be sped up, putting a bit of pressure on the Prime Minister. Is this new process going to put pressure on him, potentially expose him to those dynamics we saw played out last year?
Oh, look, I'm not sure. I think that the premiers will criticise the Prime Minister for the slowness of the vaccine rollout, because there's a lot to criticise, regardless of whether there are more meetings or not. And I do think that, you know, looking from the outside, it seems that the strategy seems to be more about sharing the blame amongst everyone from his side, rather than necessarily being able to deflect criticism.
And all of this language, Jason, war footing, oh, I don't know. It doesn't work for me, I've got to say. It's just, seems to me to be just...
Well, it's Operation Sovereign Borders.
It's a bit sort of...
Started from Operation...
We're on a war footing!
Yeah.
Just
Operation
vaccinate people.
Operation Sovereign Borders it started from, and then there was the war footing, you know, at the beginning, and it stayed on a war footing. War imagery is always very good for rallying a population around a government. Yeah,
we're going to talk a bit more about real wars soon. Well, as Neela pointed out, states can't negotiate access to vaccine doses, so the Federal Trade Minister Dan Tehan has been dispatched to Europe to do this very thing. Nearly 1,300,000 Australians have received at least one dose now, while globally the tally stands at more than 800 million doses. The increased inoculation hasn't stopped COVID cases from soaring, with the WHO urging nations not to be complacent.
We are in a critical point of the pandemic right now. The trajectory of this pandemic is growing. In the 7th week in a row, we've had more than 4.4 million new cases reported in the last week. If you compare that to a year ago, we had about 500,000 cases being reported per week. This is not the situation we want to be in 16 months into a pandemic, where we have proven control measures.
Some of those control measures have now been lifted in Britain, where the nation was locked down for much of winter. Brits have relished the chance to gather in public, flocking to pubs and restaurants, and in London's Soho area, where people gathered en masse to sing and dance on Monday evening. Greg, have these people learnt nothing? They're not all vaccinated. They're going hard at the pubs. Like, did they miss the memo, or did they not remember what happened? Are you alarmed by these images? I clearly am.
Yeah, I am a little, Patricia. I think there's been a strain of thought amongst some libertarians and also amongst a lot of young people that the virus isn't quite real. And the threat to young people is indeed quite modest, although it's not zero. Young people get sick and young people die from the virus, but they think that they're indestructible. You think that anyway when you're 20 years old. But of course, you've only got to look at the way the health systems were overwhelmed in northern Italy and New York and so on, and are nearly overwhelmed in parts of Germany quite recently, to see what happens when this virus gets out of control. Epidemiologists I spoke to at the start of this said, you know, be rest assured, coronaviruses are very stable. They don't mutate the way flu viruses do. But it turned out that the virus does mutate quite a lot. Now, I'm not criticising the epidemiologists, but the virus is turning out to be very, very unpredictable. And I think we're going to vaccination will help us a great deal, but we are still going to have to live with restricted international movement, social distancing, occasional masks, quite a lot of stuff. And you look at the way specific super spreader events led to the first crisis, like that football match in northern Italy. So you just go out and do it all again.
Yeah.
I think this still has a long way to run.
Oh, I think so too. Neela, 39 million people in Britain have received at least their first dose, but they're in those critical areas at this stage. There are a lot of people still, going out, hitting the pubs hard, having parties in Soho who clearly are not vaccinated. Sort of medically, how risky is that?
The thing with risk is that we all make our own assessment of risk. And so, this is what we're seeing playing out in Australia with people being hesitant to get one vaccine or the other. And we see this around the world in terms of people's risk of whether they think they will get coronavirus or not. I think that in Australia, because we have had such small case numbers, all things considered, and an approach that is very zero tolerance towards COVID, which I think is fantastic. It's been really good for the community. Our experience of this pandemic is actually markedly different to what it is elsewhere in the world. And I talk to friends, colleagues, family members overseas. Everyone knows someone who has had it. Everyone knows someone who has gotten sick from it. Lots of people know people who, had a mild cold and got better. And so it's a different perspective. And so I think that lends itself to perhaps a slightly more laissez-faire attitude. If, you know someone who got it and didn't get that sick, you feel a bit more invincible. It's the same as 20-year-olds driving too fast down the road. We did that last weekend and no one got hurt. Let's do it again. So I think that, risk, humans are very poor at calculating risk as an absolute thing. We all think it'll either happen or not happen, and then we make up our mind on the basis of that. So I think that's what we're seeing in the UK.
Yeah. Jason, we've got a pretty different situation here, that's true. We've got really very low risk of infection. That's why it's taking clearly so long for us to vaccinate too.
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say, I think vaccines are they're not a silver bullet. They're going to be one part of a solution. And I think that, as more and more people from the population get vaccinated, I think we can start taking some more risk. I mean, risk management means you can take risks because you're confident that they're managed, right? Having zero risk or accepting zero risk is not good risk management. So I thought it was quite extraordinary, Greg Hunt's statement this morning, saying that even if 100% of the Australian population is vaccinated, we still may not open our international borders. I really struggled to understand that. Even if the entire population is not vaccinated, if travellers are coming in from low-risk countries and they can establish that they've been vaccinated and they have a place where they can self-isolate and get tested, I cannot see how, if you have a properly risk-managed approach, we can't let people come in. So I think we just need a much more sophisticated, holistic way to look at this, rather than this one-size-fits-all, and then vaccines are going to be a silver bullet for everything.
They certainly are. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel are CEO of advisory firm Yatsen Associates and President of the Chinese Australian Forum, Jason Yatsen-Lee. In Melbourne, foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Also in Melbourne, reconstructive surgeon Dr Neela Janakiramanan. And in Canberra, former senior public servant Mari Coleman. In the last 12 months, Australia's Defence Force has been deployed to support COVID containment, to rescue people stranded by floods, and this week to help clean up the cyclone-ravaged coastlines of Western Australia. But according to Assistant Defence Minister and former SAS soldier Andrew Hastie, the military's core business will always be the application of lethal violence. Mr Hastie outlined his vision for the Defence Force in a message to his West Australian constituents, arguing that mission clarity is vital in the profession of arms. It's a view supported by Liberal backbencher and former soldier Philip Thompson.
Our ADF shouldn't be left or right. They should be straight down the middle of what their job is. And their job is to defend our nation, our interests, our values, our sovereignty, but also when we go on operations, have an unapologetic aggression and violence to get the mission done. We've gone a little bit woke over the past few years and we can't afford to be doing that.
Mari, has the military gone a bit woke?
Well, I can only assume from what I'm reading about appalling behaviour in Afghanistan that if they have, it hasn't spread very widely through the system. But truly, we do expect our military to be, as you've said in the introduction, to be very active in humanitarian exercises as well as in actually trying to kill people. And I would have thought that Afghanistan was a spectacular example of a situation where the application of violent force was perhaps not as productive in winning hearts and minds as we might have all hoped if we were thinking that there would be some kind of improvement in the condition of the people who are being destroyed by war in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not an expert on the military in any way, and I make no pretensions to be so, but I think these remarks about being woke are somewhat pathetic. I see no indication from anything I've seen, whether it's scandals coming out of abuse at Duntroon or anywhere else, that there is anything except a failure to be a little bit sensitive to issues of decency and appropriate behaviour to people.
Yeah.
I just think it's rubbish.
Greg, we also heard claim that it had lurched to the left, the military, at the same time criticism of this very interesting dance routine which was used to unveil. We've got some images, hopefully we'll get on screen of, yep, here we go, a dance, yep, and that's some awkward pictures of some top military officials and ministers watching on. They look really comfortable there. They're very, very comfortable being there. But, you know, I don't know how that dance routine, whether you think it's appropriate or not, let's park that. I don't know, they look like they're having a good time to me. But, Greg Sheridan, is that an example, really, of them being woke as the military? Are they just not living in the contemporary world?
No. It's an example of why the military shouldn't do anything remotely related to social policy whatsoever. So, Patricia, I'd like to try to frame the debate a bit differently. It's not silly comments about woke or whatever, and it goes without saying that every soldier has to obey the law, he or she has to obey the rules of warfare, and they have to behave in a way which is consistent with our national values. But why do we have a military? Why do we have a hospital? We have a hospital to treat sick people and make them better. Now, incidentally, if they do some nice things for charity or whatever, that's great. We have a military to apply deadly force to protect the peace and to protect the nation. Hopefully, the deadlier the force that they can apply, the less often they'll have to apply it. You have them to deter people who would do us harm. You have them to make a potential enemy think, if we do something against the Australians, they will impose a cost on us which is unacceptable. Now, we have been shy to talk in these terms, but it's a matter of being honest with people. I'll give you one quick example. We bought recently the Apache attack helicopter. Wonderful machine, you know, the Apache can do everything. It's known all around the world as the Apache attack helicopter. We call it our armed reconnaissance helicopter.
Sure, we sanitise the language.
Yeah, we're too polite to say
we're sanitising the language. You're
attack.
right. In that case,
you know,
it clearly kills
silly.
people. But let me be blunt here. I've watched what the military does. In fact, I saw it on my own street, Greg Sheridan, through the great Melbourne lockdown, where they were walking around telling me and my kids to make sure our masks were applied right. They were very polite, but they were actually part of the pandemic response. They went to East Timor and they were part of the peacekeeping mission. We know that they actually play a very different role too. Jason, clearly
Can I just answer that, Patricia? So very quickly, I agree. They can do lots of other things if they can do military stuff successfully.
They do those things a lot.
But one of the examples you use there is very important, East Timor. They were able to do the thing in East Timor because they were such a fierce force. You could ask Peter Cosgrove about that. They went in big numbers with a lot of weaponry, and the militia went away because, as Peter Cosgrove said, the militia was very good at killing women and children, wasn't so good at killing Australian soldiers. They were able to do all the good things because they projected force.
Let me bring Jason in.
That's why you use an army.
Yeah, they do other things, right? Bush fire recovery. I mentioned the WA, situation. Clearly, they are multifaceted. But Greg's point, putting that to you, that primarily they are a sort of killing force. Is that right?
I don't know that they're primary. I mean, it's a hell of an organisational purpose.
It's a little intense.
It's a very intense organisational purpose. And I mean, I take the Sun Tzu art of war view. The most successful armies are those that don't have to fire a shot. Right? So I don't know if it's actually the killing people or the application of lethal force. It's more the deterrent factor to show we are capable of doing this. We are a well-oiled, efficiently run machine, such that if you mess with us, then we will mess with you, rather than the actual act of doing it. But I mean, the additional point is, I think it's precisely because there's soldiers running around with big guns that it's imperative that there are guardrails, that there's a strong set of values, and that there are rules around the use of those guns. And that's what the laws of war are for. It's not a free-for-all.
You've worked in The Hague.
We're not animals.
Right?
Yeah, and there was, one of the seminal cases that I worked on was an awful case where there was a Bosnian Croat soldier who was facing the tribunal. He was part of a firing squad. It was during the fall of Srebrenica that executed over 2,000 men and boys. And before the tribunal, he pleaded duress. He said, I objected, I didn't want to be part of this firing squad, but my commander put a gun to my head and said, if you don't shoot these people, we're going to shoot you. So the question was, is duress a defence to murder? And the judges decided by majority that no, it's no defence. We might mitigate your punishment to 0, but there is still a conviction, because it's the role of international law from a policy perspective to encourage soldiers, all soldiers, if something is wrong, to stand up and to state that and to object to it. And they're the sort of values, that's the sort of standard of behaviour that we need soldiers to have.
Neela, obviously the language of woke becomes like clickbait, and I'm clicking like crazy right now, aren't I? Like, they're so woke. But if we're having a fundamental discussion about what the Defence Force for our country is there for, has Andrew Hastie just been blunt and honest about, their ultimate aim?
Look, I'm not sure what he means by woke. If he means that they,
I don't think he used woke. I think it was his colleague. He was just
true.
defining their main role.
I think that sometimes those terms are used to describe a more progressive position, and I think for a lot of people who are progressive, and perhaps this is where the sanitisation of the language comes from. The fact that war exists, the fact that soldiers go and kill people, is an uncomfortable concept because it's not very progressive. We should be able to talk about our problems. The reality is that when you have complex geopolitical scenarios, you're going to need an army, and the army is going to use violent, lethal force at certain times. But I don't think that is fundamentally inconsistent with adopting more progressive values within the organisation, because we know that things such as diversity, such as being more inclusive, actually creates better organisations. And so if we think about the military as an organisation as we would any other, you're not getting your best people into leadership positions if you're not a little bit woke. And so I don't think we should shy away from that. I think you can have a progressive military which is a safe place for soldiers to be a part of, and a place where even the people on the ground can, for example, make those human rights arguments in the theatre of war and make sure that Australia is not breaching its rules.
And Greg Sheridan, there's even been a discussion about the banning of symbols of death. Isn't that just professionalism to ban some of these symbols? Is it really an example of being left-leaning?
Yeah, no, look, I couldn't agree with you more, and I agree with everything Jason and Neela said. They're not inconsistent at all. I think what Andrew Hastie was addressing and what Peter Dutton was addressing in similar remarks last week was not that we should abandon values of inclusion and equity and so forth. Not a bit, but that we shouldn't be shy about talking about what the fundamental purpose of our military force is. The fundamental purpose is not exactly to kill people, but it is to use, or to have the potential to use, as Jason says, lethal force.
So I'm going to be a bit cheeky here, but don't we know that? Doesn't anyone, I think sort of a grade prep 6-year-old would know that the Defence Force can kill when they go to theatres of war. Why do we need to define it?
If we know it, we shouldn't be scared to say it. And, if you look at the recruitment advertisements for the Australian military, it's hey, Jacko, hey, Billo, didn't we have a lovely time? Isn't this a great career? Isn't it fabulous? Whereas what you're asking people to do is to sacrifice their lives, to put their lives at terrible risk in lethal combat to protect the welfare of the nation. And you look at recruitment advertisements in the United States, the Marines, the few, the brave, you know what you're getting into.
So you think we should change our whole marketing strategy?
Well, I just think we should be honest in our dialogue, that's all.
And if
so
we
should
changed our
include...
marketing strategy, do you suspect fewer people would sign up?
Well, few enough people sign up as it is, but I really wouldn't reduce it to marketing and so forth. I just think
but the idea of what you're telling people you do.
Yeah. I just think you need to have a really honest, especially in these times when, you know, our geostrategic circumstances are extremely troubling. It's quite possible that there's going to be conflict in Taiwan and so forth. This country faces much bigger challenges than it realises. It's better, just as we're saying the government should be transparent about vaccines, it should be transparent about the purposes of the military.
Mari, should it be more transparent? I mean, we do sort of sanitise and sell it as a fantastic, enjoyable, fulfilling career, but for many people, if you look at actually there's a really very tragic side, there are people who come back with a lot of trauma from some of these roles.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I find myself slightly surprised to see how much I'm in agreement with Greg.
Oh, this happens. This is kumbaya.
It happens. Yeah, we do need to be transparent about this, but at the same time, we are recognising that the Australian Defence Force is used to do a great many things which are quite peaceful and community building, as well as being available to actually give the clear impression, as Jason said, don't mess with us because we're not just nice people. We can, in fact, give you a bloody nose if it's necessary.
Well, something that Greg mentioned is worth us having just a brief conversation about. Former Defence Minister Christopher Pyne has raised the prospect of a future conflict with China, warning that Taiwan is the most likely flashpoint. Christopher Pyne, who actually stepped down from the role in 2019, told graduating students at the University of Adelaide that the threat of war in the Indo-Pacific region has grown considerably in recent years.
The strategic posture of the People's Republic of China is not as benign as it was. The reality is that China is confident and capable and is not embarrassed to show it. This isn't rhetoric. This is something that you and I may well have to confront in the next 5 to 10 years.
Jason, is he right? It's not just rhetoric, but if you look at the sort of muscling up of China in recent times, this is a very live possibility.
Yeah, I think the risk of armed conflict has definitely gone up. I think China is being much more assertive about its interests in various places around the world. I'm not sure I'd say Taiwan would be the flashpoint. I mean, it's a very complex calculus there. I don't think China would make a decision to go and invade Taiwan unless it had a very well-informed view that the United States would not intervene. Otherwise, the costs to China would be too great. I personally think that the greatest risk to armed conflict will happen as an accident. You know, as part of argy-bargy around the South China Sea, something happens, shots are fired, it quickly escalates, and then it's a free-for-all. And that's how World War I started, frighteningly. So that's what we need to be very careful of. And I think the real question here is, what role does Australia want to play in this whole scenario? Is our role to side with one of the two parties, or is a better role for us to do everything that we can to ensure that this doesn't happen, to de-escalate, to play our proud middle power role that we have historically, to put mechanisms in place to de-escalate conflicts and to resolve disputes peacefully?
Neela, should that be the role Australia plays here? Because there is obviously a domestic debate about just how hard we go, how to do it quietly, publicly, on the megaphone. This has been really a theme of Australian politics over the last few years.
Yeah, I look, my personal preference would be for Australia to play a diplomatic role rather than an armed conflict role. I think as a layperson, it's very difficult to really understand or believe these kinds of statements. You know, I'm not an expert on China. I don't follow that sort of politics. But, you know, we are, as Jason said before, you know, a country where Operation Sovereign Borders, for example, was such a big policy statement that our politics is very much rooted in racism. It is very much rooted in making Australians afraid of people who are different, countries that are different. And so as a layperson, I find it very difficult to differentiate between the sort of rhetoric that is meant to look to the government for protection and the kind of rhetoric which is genuinely providing some sort of warning about what might happen, which is a slightly long-winded answer to your question, but at the end of the day, my preference would be for Australia to take a diplomatic role. It's something that we've done well in the past.
Greg Sheridan, what's the purpose of this warning? What is he getting at?
Well, Patricia, Christopher Pyne is in very good company. A week or two ago, Admiral Davidson, who's the head of all US forces in the Pacific, said he thought there was a good chance that China would launch a military invasion of Taiwan or a military action against Taiwan within the next 5 or 6 years. Now, I've interviewed almost all the Pacific commanders over the last 40 years. They're the most hard-headed people in the entire American chain of command, because they'd have to deal with any trouble that broke out. But they're also extremely cautious about what they say in public. His remarks were clearly authorised by the Biden White House. Now, this is the Biden White House we're talking about, not the Trump White House. And what they are doing is making these public statements in order to deter the Chinese. To let, as Jason said, the Chinese would only probably act on Taiwan if they thought the Americans wouldn't intervene. What the Americans are doing is saying, we are really watching what you're doing, and if you act, we will act. Now, that's very, very worrying for everybody. But just one very important footnote to you. Neela's very important point, shouldn't we be diplomatic rather than military? I tell you, we won't have a choice. Our communications facilities are quite central to the American ability to run their submarines, launch their missiles, see when Chinese missiles are launched and so on. If a real conflict kicks off, the Chinese will attack those facilities, whether we're formally part of the hostilities or not. Secondly, there is no chance at all, if there are hostilities, that we'll be able to export anything to China. But thirdly, what would it say if we said to the Americans, we don't care about 25 million independent democratic people in Taiwan, just sacrifice them to a dictatorship? Why wouldn't they take the same view to us down the track?
Now, let's park that one. We know that many of you watching tonight have young children. Some of them are probably bouncing off the walls in between being urged to sit and eat their dinner or get in the bath. Most of this is normal behaviour. OK, it's a bit distracting, sure, but it's normal, right? Australian researchers say these behaviours are leading to an overdiagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a label that can do more harm than good. Louise Kasda from the University of Sydney School of Public Health was one of the researchers working on the study.
The problem is there is no definite biological threshold to these behaviours. So on the one hand, I think excessive and really problematic behaviours are relatively easy to identify. But as you move further towards the mild behavioural difficulties, it gets really blurry and sort of difficult to distinguish which child may be struggling and which child just may need a bit more attention and just maybe is a bit more immature than his peers or her peers. Also, what we found that even though diagnosis rates are really increasing, this is not reflected in any way in increasing symptoms in the population. So we didn't really find that children have been getting more hyperactive or more inattentive over the last 20, 30 years. One of our concerns is that really by widening this so much, ADHD is really reduced to this controversy rather than being recognized as a real challenge that some children and parents face. So the diagnosis itself gets watered down in a way, it loses some of its legitimacy, and really more in practical terms, it becomes obviously more and more difficult for them to access support that they need in education settings or in terms of specialist care, because the group of children just grows and grows.
Neela, is there a danger in overdiagnosing children?
Look, this paper has created ripples amongst the paediatric aspect of the medical community. I'm not a paediatrician, but I've certainly spoken to some paediatricians about this paper. I've spoken to some statisticians about this paper. These sorts of diagnoses are complicated. They are nuanced. They're generally made by teams of people. They are generally made by people who have very specific expertise in diagnosing these conditions. So I think that the suggestion that there is an overdiagnosis, particularly in a context where a vast majority of children who need this sort of specialist care cannot access it because there is a shortage of publicly funded services that provide this sort of assessment, and it is catastrophically expensive through the private system for a lot of families, particularly lower income families, is troublesome. This paper looked at studies from around the world. It wasn't novel research. It was a review of research that has been done. There are different criteria that are used in different countries, and so perhaps it's not easy to extrapolate, for example, the American experience to the Australian experience. What was clear from the study is that diagnoses have gone up. That was certainly true. Whether that represents an increase in diagnosis of mild patients is equivocal, and whether there is any harm that is done because patients with milder forms of these issues receive a diagnosis is not really a conclusion that can be drawn. I saw that the author had written an additional piece in the conversation about this, where they made the issue. They raised the issue that if you diagnose too many people, then those with more severe disease may not get access to treatment. I think that that's a really problematic argument, because what it says is that what it's not calling for is an increase in the kitty. What we need is more services that can provide these services. What we need is more treatment options. What we need is better ability to analyse the treatment options that are available. And I think that's really hard in a lot of medical conditions, and I think it's probably particularly hard in a lot of paediatric conditions, because you may not see the effect of early intervention for these conditions for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And so for researchers, it is difficult to follow that up. And for governments, which are predominantly short-term governments, investing in interventions that may or may not yield benefits in decades' time is a hard ask. So I would hope that people would look at that particular study with a huge amount of caution.
We are out of time, so I can't go to the rest of you on that, but I've got to say the one thing we also want to avoid is heaping on more parent guilt, right? I just feel like some of these studies are just more and more parent guilt all the time. Thank you so much to the four of you. What a wonderful panel you've been. And that's all we have time for. Thank you to our panel, Jason Yatsen-Lee, Greg Sheridan, Dr. Neela Janakiramanan and Mari Coleman. Have an excellent evening. Stan Grant is with you tomorrow. I'm back on Friday. I hope you have an absolutely excellent night. Good night.